Okay, in this video, I'm going to give you a really brief working definition of rhetoric. We're going to start with Aristotle's definition, and then I'll talk through my definition and how both of them connect to why we study rhetoric in writing to help you understand the connection between, like, why is this an intro class for intro to rhetoric for writers. So if we start with Aristotle's definition, and he was not the first Greek rhetorician to define rhetoric. So that's the purpose of the timeline. So I'm assuming at this point you've looked at the timeline, you've seen the names, and you'll see that Aristotle, not the first, about halfway, 3/4 of the way through, so that you understand overall development, and then we'll actually read through the growth starting next week. So we're jumping ahead a little bit. Aristotle's working definition of rhetoric is the art of seeing the available means of persuasion in a given situation. Okay, so not ethos, pathos, and logos, not ethos, pathos, and logos. We're going to talk about that extensively. That is not how we define rhetoric. Ever. Done. Aristotle's definition, the art of seeing the available means of persuasion. So it's really important that he defined it as an art. There are, I would say, hundreds of years of scholarly articles on why it's so important that Aristotle defined rhetoric as an art. Mostly, and really importantly, it's connected to the human experience and the way that humans experience the world and then make meaning through those experiences. Like, that's what we know, and that's how we know, and that's how we strive for knowing. And all of those things are really, really, really important to then how we understand and define the world, which is the rest of his definition, right? So if it's the art of seeing the available means of persuasion in a given situation, we need to understand the situation. We need to understand what we're trying to communicate, what's available to communicate in a specific situation, and then how, which is where we get to the really, really important thing. Okay, so the Greeks did not invent rhetoric. Basically, rhetoric always existed. The Greeks named it. And then they started refining it. They realized, oh, if we want this thing that we're calling democracy, because they did invent a new form of government with democracy, which we obviously still use today in a different variation, different form. We have a great government program. I'm briefly defining, they'll talk about it much more extensively. So if we look at the connection between communication or writing and why it was so important for the Greeks to define this thing that we were doing, they really needed a way when people, especially a group of people, were leading together, they needed to get along, which means they needed to be able to effectively communicate with each other so that they could argue for changing something or maintaining the status quo or levying taxes so that they could afford a new street or a new waterway, both of which they had, both of which had to be paid for somehow, right? So they had to argue with each other. And in this case, argument is not just a fight. So, like, sure, there was fighting, and sure, there were assassinations, and there's a whole story of Greek history, right? We all know the Greek god stuff from middle school and high school. But what we're really focused on is when we need to get something done, what does communication look like, and how do we understand that? And so that's where Aristotle's definition comes in, and that's where in naming rhetoric, what the Greeks really did is they separated out and they made us able to talk about content and form. What is the thing being communicated about? And the thing doesn't have to be a noun. It can be an idea. It can be a really complicated idea. It can be a scientific principle. It can be so many different things, but it is what we're communicating about. That's the content. So right now I'm talking about the history of rhetorical theory to help you understand definitions. And then we get to the form. What does the communication look like? This is an online asynchronous class. So you're not coming to a classroom space where we can talk this through. Instead, I create videos that you access. And then because I want to help you, because these are all new ideas, understand what are the important things being shared and what are the anchor points for those things being shared so that we know the second discussion of them is an example. There are guided notes. So embedding this video into a guided note to help you recognize the anchor points. So I've now said form and content a couple different times. So look at the questions in the guided notes. That's going to help you from a form perspective recognize not just what is being communicated, content, but the choices that are being made to communicate it and why those choices. Like, what do those choices accomplish? What do they get someone who's listening to it? What do they get for the audience? What do they get for the speaker? And that's what is so like revolutionary about Greek rhetoric and in Greeks naming rhetoric is they're not just looking at the communication and what's being communicated, they're looking at the how. And then they start inventing and theorizing all of these new concepts related to the how. Concepts that we still use today in writing. Brainstorming is not something that writers came up with. Brainstorming has existed since Greek oral culture times. It's invention. We're coming up with the what is it we're communicating about, what examples are meaningful, and then how should we talk about them? What should they look like structurally? Where should these ideas live and why should they live there? And so a lot of the things that the Greeks talked about in relation to rhetoric still impact writing today. How do we come up with ideas? How do we situate our ideas in a way that's meaningful for that context? So now we should see a really close connection between Aristotle's definition of seeing the available means of persuasion in a given context and the way we understand writing, creating a text that circulates meaning that is meaningful in a situation and a given audience, right? That's a terrible definition because I was trying to make them different but the same. They're very similar. But that's why writing is so useful, or why writing finds rhetoric and rhetorical theory so useful, is we're looking for both content and form, the what and the how. Okay, so then if we look to my definition, I add a few more words than Aristotle did to help us understand that. So I usually define rhetoric in the rhetorical situation as text, context, audience, purpose, and culture, so that we can really bring in how do we look at the text, the audience, and the context is interconnected and influenced by culture, and how does culture allow us to understand what is available and what is not available, which still has connections to Aristotle's initial definition. It's just expanded because the way we understand audience, especially now that we've gone through that post-1960s shift to we can understand and critique texts to understand what forms are possible, while also inventing text, which was the only thing that Greek rhetoric could do. So contemporary is expanding upon that to help us understand the difference between critiquing and inventing, and then using critiquing to help me invent, and how all of that coexists all the time, all at once. Okay, so my definition of rhetoric would include text, context, audience, purpose, and culture, where Aristotle was looking for the available means of persuasion in a given situation. Similar but different, both very important to understanding both content and form in a given situation, which is why it's so helpful to writing.